Wow, this is the biggest crowd we've had in here since we resumed in-person events last spring. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, who's over there. As a number of you may know, we're in mourning here at P&P over the loss earlier this week of our extraordinary chief book buyer, Mark Laframboise, who worked here for nearly 25 years. Alyssa and I announced Mark's passing earlier today in an email, so I won't dwell on it now, but I do want to note that that a bookstore like this one is only as good as its staff, and Mark was the best. We all miss him very much, and if he were here, he'd want us to get on with the program and to celebrate this great new book by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Peter and Susan, of course, are one of the great journalistic couples working today. Peter's chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC. Susan's a staff writer at The New Yorker, writing a weekly column on life in Washington, and she's a global affairs analyst at CNN. Between them, they have a wide range of experience reporting, editing, and analyzing domestic and international stories. Together, they spent a tour in Moscow as co-bureau chiefs in the early 2000s, and out of that joint experience, they co-authored a book about the early years of Vladimir Putin's rule of Russia, Kremlin Rising. And 2 years ago, they came out with another excellent book, a biography of former master Washington power broker James Baker III. Their new book has received wide praise and as the most comprehensive account of Trump's presidency so far. But as Peter and Susan note in it, they almost weren't going to be in Washington for the Trump years, having initially planned to spend them reporting in Israel. Then on the night Trump was elected, Peter, who already had moved to Jerusalem, received a message from Susan, who was still in Washington getting ready to join him. "Do you want to come back to D.C. for Trump?" She asked, given what they already sensed would be an epic story of disruption, or maybe I should say a story of epic disruption. Anyway, Peter did come back, and the two of them became, as they describe it in their book, foreign correspondents, not in the Middle East, but in Trump's Washington. In their extensive reporting for the book, Peter and Susan came across many new stories and also developed new insights into stories that they thought they knew and that we thought we knew. But beyond the fresh revelations, and there are indeed quite a few, about what was the most chaotic, disruptive, norm-breaking U.S. presidency ever, The Divider succeeds in synthesizing and interpreting much of what happened during the Trump years. It makes a compelling and convincing case that the efforts to overturn the 2020 election at the end of Trump's term was a direct outgrowth of many things that transpired all the way back to the term's start 4 years before. And of course, the threat that Trump poses to democracy remains, which makes a study like this all the more important and relevant. Now, as an added attraction this evening, Peter and Susan will be in conversation with another very accomplished journalist and a close friend of theirs, Jane Mayer. We love it when the moderator gets a lot of applause too. She's chief Washington correspondent for The New Yorker, where she's been for 27 years, and also the author of 4 authoritative books that have deepened our understanding of such important topics as the money behind the rise of the radical right, the war on terror, the Clarence Thomas hearings, and the Iran-Contra affair and unraveling of the Reagan presidency. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Peter, Susan, and Jane.
Are these on? Okay. Welcome. Thanks so much. What a great crowd. Fantastic. You guys really know how to bring them out, or else Trump does.
It's the moderator.
I just want to say Peter and Susan are fabulous friends, but in reality, not just because they are my friends. This book is astounding, and almost every page of it has something that in any other administration would have been a complete scandal in its own right. I am amazed. I was searching for what the right adjectives would be, and I'm somewhere between appalling and harrowing, I think. So congratulations. It's really an amazing book with an unbelievable amount of reporting in it. And in some ways, I think the story it tells is the story of the failure of American accountability at this point. At every step, the guardrails failed. Somehow, the vetting process didn't work during the 2016 election. The press, somehow, we didn't get the message across. And then once in office, I think this is where this book just fills in so much more. The enablers around Trump saw the danger, but they didn't really tell anyone, or at least not enough. And so that's what my first question to you is, what was their calculation? Tell us a little bit about John Kelly, the chief of staff, who actually thought Trump was mentally ill, literally, went and studied it. Tell us a little bit about this, and what would have happened if he went public, and why didn't he? Would it have made any difference?
Well, thank you, Jane. We can see the real attraction tonight. So, I want to thank you. And, of course, I want to thank Brad and Lissa and everyone at Politics and Prose at a tough time. This is an institution that, everyone's here because it means a lot to them. So I think we all thank you for that. The book is a big, ambitious take at something that people will be writing books about, for as long as we're around and then some, right? People are still writing books about Watergate and finding new things. And one of the subjects that they're going to be mining and exploring forever is what Donald Trump showed us about the people who surrounded him, right? He was a mirror and not necessarily a flattering one for other people's souls. And so the book is definitely the story of Trump's enablers, because without them, he'd just be an angry dude staring at the television in between golf games and yelling. And so, but I think it's a mistake also, though, to paint it with too broad of a brush. There's not one category of enablers. In fact, the book is filled with stories of multiple different kinds. There are certainly the kind of national security, nonpartisan, professional types who perhaps really did feel that they were there either to, stand in to save the country, to, constrain the president, who perhaps really did not understand the nature of the threat that Trump did pose and would pose to institutions. So that's one category. Then there are every variety of opportunist, grifter, ambitious type. One of Trump's gifts, and he certainly has a number of gifts, one of them is to identify people to surround him who will be dependent upon him. And that's a way that he ran the Trump Organization. It's a way that he ran the White House. And many of the folks in Trump's cabinet or in the upper levels of his government never would have had those jobs in any other presidency. And of course, that makes those people highly dependent upon him, or certainly not willing to denounce him publicly. So, again, we can talk more about the different categories of enablers, because I think that the book really is an extended, sort of reporting around Trump as well as Trump himself. But you asked about John Kelly, and I do think he's one of the more fascinating characters. I think that John Kelly and a number of the others in this bucket believed that speaking out publicly against Trump only led to creating the kind of enemy and the kind of fight that Trump craved. And it's the same reason you don't hear much from George W. Bush about Donald Trump, even though Bush obviously is not a big fan of him. There's this fear of Donald Trump. And it's kind of fascinating to me as an observer, right, Jen? All these big, brawny men, what are they so afraid of? But John Kelly, he really did loathe Donald Trump. And you mentioned he used to call it, in fact, the worst effing job in the world. And that was while he was the serving White House chief of staff. People would come in for job interviews, and he would tell them, don't take the job that I'm interviewing you for. He said, especially to young people, he said, you will have the stink of Donald Trump upon you if you say yes to this job. He actually did secretly purchase that book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, the one by the group of psychiatrists and the like that came out during Trump's first year. And he told others that he found it to be a useful guide to a president who certainly seemed to meet all the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, among other issues.
And if he had gone public and said, I'm reading a psychiatric manual and I believe our president is the case in point, would it have made a difference, do you think? And if not that, was there anything else either you were looking for or came across that you think might have made some difference to how the country looked at Trump and even maybe to his followers?
Well, first of all, let me also thank Jane in particular for doing this. If you read this book, you will see her reporting that we have stolen from liberally throughout the book. Because I'm serious, I don't think there's any other reporter who did a better job of finding important and untold stories during the Trump years. And Jane, I'm not kidding, I'm totally serious. Go back and read her work in the New Yorker. It was fabulous. I want to thank Brad and Lissa. Oh my God, they're just the best. This is really such an important institution, and our condolences for a tough week. And I want to thank Bill Hamilton in the back, who was my editor through the Trump years. Could not have gotten through it without him. Anything in this book that derives from our time of covering him was because Bill helped us through a very, very very challenging moment. He's the best editor around. He also happens to be a very good taste in terms of picking spouses because he's Jane's husband. And I want to mention my great friend and partner and mentor, Don Baker, who's with us tonight. Don and I were partners in the Richmond Bureau many, many years ago, and I learned pretty much everything I know about journalism from Don, and I'm so glad to see him here tonight. So, what was the question? Oh, would it have made a difference? Oh, no, I know. Yeah, I know. Would it have made a difference?
Made a difference?
No, I mean, I think the answer is no, because look what happened. Like, everybody says, oh, if only you had told us this earlier. We've told it to you now, and nothing has changed, right? I mean, all these revelations, all these books that have come out, all these stories that have come out, did any of them actually make a big difference? I think everybody's looking for this, this clean silver bullet that's going to suddenly wake up everybody who likes Trump and say, oh my gosh, he's not what I thought he was. And the truth is, they've had multiple opportunities if they were open to that conversation, and they're not. They don't see it that way. People who have spoken out against Trump, who work for him, are traitors. There are people who are disgruntled former employees, or they're, hostages of the liberal media and the Democrats, or what have you. It doesn't matter how conservative they are. He manages to make people who are very conservative, like John Bolton, into somehow, a discredited figure on the right. How is that possible? John Bolton has been conservative a lot longer than Donald Trump has, right? And John Bolton wrote his book saying an awful lot of things that were pretty disturbing in there, and suddenly it didn't change anybody's mind, at least in the broad sense, about Trump. So I don't think any single thing by itself is going to change people's minds. I think it's possible there's a long corrosion of support for him as people get tired, but I think people understand these things, and they have decided to either they are shocked by them, or they've discounted them.
Yeah,
Susan?
I do want to add one other point, because it's funny. It can get lost in the conversation sometime. But arguably, actually, it did make a difference. And all of the reports in real time about this dysfunctional White House, in many ways, because of the infighting, because of the cycling through of this, we had more real-time information because of the hard work of journalists like Jane and Peter and others about this White House than almost any other. It's really hard to, find the drama until after the fact of a lot of White Houses. That wasn't the case here. And by the way, Donald Trump actually did lose support. He was defeated by more than 7 million votes in the 2020 election. And a lot of times, because he's remained this sort of ongoing threat in the public space after the presidency, as opposed to all the other presidents of our memory. We tend to almost actually forget that he was defeated in 2020 by more than 7 million votes. In fact, Donald Trump is the first president since Herbert Hoover to lose the presidency, the White House, and the Senate in just 4 years. And yet there is a sort of and I understand why, a sort of self-flagellating impulse, why didn't they tell us? But actually we knew an awful lot contemporaneously. What Peter and I are trying to do is to establish for the historical record as much, kind of granular understanding of this for history as possible. But I would say that, we had an incredible amount of unbelievably scandalous, damning detail almost in real time in this presidency. In some ways, that made it very unique relative to other presidencies that we've all covered.
It's true. I mean, and as I started by saying, many of the things that you will see on every page in this book would have just blown up another administration, which is kind of the amazing thing about it. I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, you're right, he got reelected, but how close do you think it would have come if not for COVID? And why did he blow the handling of that as badly as he did, and how important was that in defeating him?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. It may not be the revelations or the the people who came out and opposed to him. It may have been just simply the fact that hundreds of thousands of people died, the economy cratered, and it was and his handling of it was widely criticized. So I think that is a big deal. I think COVID is a big deal. We have some stuff in the book that I don't think has been out there before, in which he's pressuring the health bureaucracy, the health officials, the scientists to twist and turn in ways that the facts didn't justify in their view. We have some things in there about even his own wife, Melania Trump, who thought he was, quote, blowing it. That's what she told Chris Christie. She told the president. She said, "You're blowing this." And she told him early on that he wasn't taking it seriously enough, and he basically brushed her off. So she actually calls Chris Christie and begs him to come to the White House basically to talk some sense into the president, make him take this more seriously. It obviously didn't really stick. But I think you're right. COVID was a huge factor, and it's hard to disaggregate what caused his defeat. It's possible he would have won had it not been for COVID.
I mean, it's interesting that it was kind of a collision, it seemed like, between him and facts and reality that he couldn't fake. Everything else, he seemed like you write a lot about how he was using the White House as his own stage to do his own show. And somehow COVID, did he think he could talk his way into the country believing that it wasn't real? I mean, I find it baffling that he was as bad at handling it as he was.
Well, I think, Jane, that's one of the things that we wanted to go back and examine more in kind of revisiting that story. And the sort of insight that I came away with that I didn't necessarily have at the time was that Donald Trump's playbook is his playbook. And one of the things that's so extraordinary is that his playbook for a once-in-a-century pandemic and public health crisis was actually not that dissimilar from his playbook for a feud with the Pentagon or a feud with the Justice Department, and that in fact obviously it was, from the point of view of outcomes and people not dying, it was wildly unsuited. But from the point of view of politics, what stands out to me is that Trump was in many ways very successful, right? Even in creating an alternate reality, which is one of the things that, as president he did basically with everything. He got millions of people to go along with his alternate realities, whether it was demanding that the FDA approve hydroxychloroquine for use in the pandemic. He basically bullied his brand new FDA chief, who had just started work, had just been confirmed by the Senate weeks before the pandemic began, bullied into approving it, later had to retract that approval. Trump continued to pressure the public health agencies in a way that's very similar to both the public and the private pressure that he exerted, say, on the Justice Department. So, there are many mysteries to probe in this, but I do think that, one of the things we shouldn't discount is that Donald Trump, is a very stubborn guy in his 70s, and it's like a bad boyfriend. You know, he's not going to change.
We'll try not
I'm
to
not
hold
sure
you
I like
to
that analogy in particular.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
there are a lot of there are some amusing, facts in this book. At least to me, darkly amusing. One was, speaking of COVID, that you go and interview Donald Trump in this book, and among the things you ask him about was the fact that his I guess his grandfather died of in the great influenza, and he says no, it never happened, even though he was the source of the information in the first place to others that it had, and so I'm curious about why you think he spoke to you, because you go there and see him, you're not going to probably be friendly, and the first thing he did, it sounds like, was start to lie again about his family and everything else.
Yeah, no.
Why did he see you?
It's a good question. Why did he see? Well, he saw a lot of authors. First of all, we're not unique and don't want to pretend that we were. He saw a lot of authors in the months after he left office, and I think part of it is he wanted to talk. He wanted somebody who would listen. We were there. We would listen. I think he also has this phenomenal confidence that he has the ability to charm or convince or persuade anybody of anything. If he could just simply sit down with you for a while, you'll see it his way. And look, he is in fact a very transparent guy, right? He's not making pretense about what his real motivations are. That's the one thing that's actually rather remarkable among presidents. He doesn't pretend that he's pursuing this in order to pursue some greater good. He's telling us that he's pursuing this or that to take revenge against enemies or to help out his friends and so forth. So you go to an interview like that not expecting him to be a fact witness, okay? He's not a reliable fact witness. As Jane just said, he either lied or doesn't know about his own grandfather having died of the influenza. The very first thing he told us in the second interview was exactly contradictory to the very first thing he told us in the first interview, right? The first interview we asked him, well, a lot of your supporters are skeptical about the vaccine. Will you do a public service announcement telling him that it's a good thing? This should be his proudest accomplishment, or one of his proudest accomplishments. Record time this vaccine came out. He says, yeah, I'm going to do that. The Biden administration asked him to do it. Okay, great. Second interview 7 months later, well, sir, how come you never did that PSA you were going to do for the vaccine? Well, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, the Biden administration was asked you to do it. Nobody ever asked me to do a PSA. Who told you that? Well, you told us that. And so was he lying the first time? Was he lying the second time? Was he in some sort of fugue where he doesn't know the difference? And that's the hard thing, right? So you can't interview him asking, what happened in this meeting? What did you say at this particular moment? Because you can't trust anything that's said. I mean, our friends at the Washington Post catalog us 30,000 false or misleading statements during his presidency. So you go for the mindset. You go to kind of take stock of the way he thinks, right, and what he's talking about. And the sort of rambling stream of consciousness, never put a subject and a verb and a period together kind of conversation is kind of a roadmap into his psyche in some way.
Did you find him at all charming?
Oh, Jane, you know my answer to this. Look, I had heard that word used before by a number of people who had, over the 4 years, interviewed Trump or had meetings with him. And, I think what we're looking at here is a situation of defining deviancy down. Because Donald Trump is not a fire-breathing, ranter in person, so that's true. He greets you in a normal way. In fact, he at Mar-a-Lago, he's playing sort of, Napoleon and Elba, but meets banquet hall greeter. He has you sitting in the lobby of Mar-a-Lago, and this is a dues-paying private club. There's, in fact, one of those, poster boards in the front when we went there that said, sign up for Mother's Day brunch now. And you're there as part of a show, right? You are there. So, he's not like, enemies of the people die. He's like, may I get you a Diet Coke? But he's not charming. There's nothing charming about this. In fact, you can't even get a word in edgewise. When Peter says that it's all a run-on sentence, not only is it a run-on sentence, but it's like a live-action version of that now banned Twitter feed. So, I mean, any person you asked about, he's slinging insults at, just like the Twitter insults. He is, ranting and raving about dead people voting in the rigged election before you've had a chance to get a single question out. And it's just what you might expect is what I would say. But, to the question of why did he have us there? You know, I do think that there is something about Trump as a performer that is very, he doesn't process information in a conventional way, so he doesn't read briefings and get information that way. He definitely doesn't read the New Yorker, I have to tell you, Jane. I'm sorry. Not familiar with my written work, I would say, but he does have a very visual memory, and he definitely recognized faces. He saw me on CNN. He hate watches Don Lemon. He hate watches Morning Joe, and is on a very first name basis, at least in his own mind, with Mika and Joe. Definitely. He defined a lot of the job of president in a way that we've never had before. Donald Trump didn't want to have meetings in his office like any other president. He rejected a normal schedule. He basically colonized a small private dining room off of the side of the Oval Office, and he made that sort of his personal media bunker, right? And he, sat there. According to his aides, he spent something like 4 to 6 hours a day watching television and then tweeting about the things that he saw on TV. And one White House official told me that they thought that Trump defined himself in the role as like the character Mike TV in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Mike TV is the little American boy who loved television so much that he sat in front of the TV all day long, and he asked Willy Wonka to transport him inside the TV. So that's who we're dealing with here.
I do know that he did know who both of you were, though, because if I'm remembering this right, there was a tweet where he said something about how terrible Peter was, a Trump hater, and then he said, and the wife is even worse. And I kind of remember we were thinking of making you a T-shirt that was going to say, and the wife is even worse, right? Wasn't that?
Although, by the way, he didn't say my name. So imagine that you make the enemies list, but just as a +1.
On a more serious note, I guess I wonder from your research what you consider to have been maybe the most dangerous moment that you came across in the Trump years. And I guess I'll set aside January 6th because we're all familiar with that. But were there other moments that you would look at as really dangerous to democracy, dangerous to the world?
I mean, it's hard to narrow them down. It is, the point of the book in some ways, this is the first book that's tried to do all 4 years of the Trump presidency. And the reason is that because January 6th is not an aberration. It's not an outlier. It was the inevitable outcome of a 4-year war on institutions. And time again, he was pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits beyond where they'd ever been pushed before. Not to say they haven't been pushed before. The presidents have certainly tried it in different ways, but never, I think, on a sustained, aggressive way that he did. So you mentioned dangerous times. We have it. There are times even just in terms of conflict with foreign nations, he was so aggressive on North Korea at first. Remember Fire and Fury and Apocalypse, Holocaust, all that kind of stuff. That John Kelly, his chief of staff, former 4-star general, was really worried that we were going to go to war. He really thought that we were on the edge of an escalation that would get us into a nuclear confrontation. And that's why he and others kind of pushed Trump, or at least nudged him to do this whole diplomacy thing, which kind of went radically the other direction when suddenly he's having a love affair with Kim Jong-un. It went further, I think, than any of his aides imagined, but they figured at least that was better than having a war, right? Time and time again, Trump would try to push his military people to bomb or have missile strikes at Iranian sites in which we had no cause to hit. And his generals would tell him, sir, we have no legal basis to do that. That would be a war crime. He said, yeah, but can't you do it? Time and time again, he would say to Kirstjen Nielsen, for instance, his Homeland Security Secretary, just shut the border, or just take this immigration or that immigration order. And she would say, sir, that's not legal. We don't have the authority to do it. And he would say to her, honey, just do it. It got so much the fact that she told her staff that if she ever wrote a memoir, she would title it, Honey, Just Do It. Because that was what he kept saying. It did not matter to him when people told him it was illegal. He said at one point to immigration people, it's okay, I'll just pardon you. And so I think there was a 4-year succession of events like that in which January 6th is in context.
Was there anyone who he really listened to, or whose approval he sought, or who he cared about? I mean, whether it was Rupert Murdoch, Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin. I mean, who did he?
Yes.
Yes, really.
Well, Trump is a sort of worshiper at the cult of strength, right? As he defines it. Strong is probably the biggest compliment in his vocabulary, and I think it helps to explain his admiration for strong men, whether foreign dictators like Xi Jinping of China. Peter once heard Trump waxing practically poetic on Air Force One back from a summit meeting about Xi Jinping's ability to get what he wanted in his system easily, and he pointed out that if someone was arrested for drug abuse or drug dealing in China, he could be executed, I believe, by the end of the day. No problems, no mess. He of course had this long-standing, even predating the White House, admiration for Vladimir Putin. There's an amazing scene early on in the book when he is on the phone with his daughter Ivanka Trump when Rupert Murdoch calls, and his assistant comes in and asks whether he wants to take the call, and he practically goes apoplectic and he says, never put Rupert Murdoch on hold. And that shows you that he's responding to those he believes might have power over him. But I don't think, it's not listening to in a conventional sense of respect. There were a couple of mentors who were very important in his early career that he would constantly invoke, mostly because he was perpetually dissatisfied with his staff, with his advisors, his cabinet officials, his lawyers especially. So, he was constantly saying during these never-ending investigations, where is my Roy Cohn? The ghost of Roy Cohn loomed large over Donald Trump and his presidency. He considered Roy Cohn to be his mentor and a guide in many ways, and would actually directly chide the White House counsel. One time, Don McGahn, his first White House counsel, was taking notes at a meeting, and Trump, very suspicious, right, of things that could potentially be used against him later, said, "Why are you taking notes?" And McGahn replied something to the effect of, well, because that's what lawyers do. And Trump said, well, not my lawyers. That's not how Roy Cohn would handle it. And Don McGahn said, well, that's what good lawyers do.
Wow. Among the people that he seems to have held in growing contempt was, interestingly, Mitch McConnell. As you describe it in the book. I mean, and he came up with nicknames calling McConnell the Old Crow and quite a few worse things, it sounds like. I'm curious about why McConnell in particular drew his ire, because many people consider McConnell a key enabler of Trump. He didn't stand up to him. He didn't make, convict him during those impeachments. He's been called the grave digger of democracy by a historian of the Third Reich because he allowed Trump to flourish. So why does Trump have a special thing against McConnell, do you think?
That's a great question. Of course, first of all, go back to Jane's great piece on McConnell to understand this relationship. But I think McConnell was different than some of the other congressmen because he understood that McConnell actually was making a Faustian bargain with him, right? You and I aren't going to fight. We're going to work on judges. It's an area where we all can agree as conservatives, and you'll get the credit with conservatives, and I want these judges through. And it was a very transactional kind of deal. But he knew that McConnell didn't like him. McConnell didn't even pretend to like him. Like Kevin McCarthy, at least, is out there saying, yes, sir, you're great, da-da-da-da. All these other Republicans, even the ones who don't like him, would sit there and tell him that they did. People like Lindsey Graham, who called him a kook when he was a candidate against him, suddenly says he's awesome, he's great, blah, blah, blah. Mind you, to us, at one point he said, he's actually a lying mother effer. That was the phrase he used. And then he added, but he's a lot of fun to hang out with, which is exactly what happened. Mitch McConnell never pretended that Donald Trump was fun to hang out with. He never thought that he was somebody he wanted to be buddies with. He couldn't, so Trump couldn't get to him. You see, that's my view of it. Like, in other words, they had a transactional bargain, right? And it's one where McConnell let him get away with all kinds of stuff in order to get the things he wanted, which is the judges. And McConnell didn't publicly fight with him or stand up against him, except in that one really powerful speech at the end of the trial, in which he had voted to acquit. But he just never could get to McConnell in the way that he got to other Republicans.
That's interesting. Susan, you've written a wonderful profile of Mike Pompeo, and he's one of the cabinet members that sort of slips away ill-like without getting a lot of attention in this administration. I wonder, do you think he was a full-fledged Trumper? Or was he one of those people who said, I'm just here in order to help land the plane, keep the country protected? And do you expect we're going to be seeing more of him?
Well, it's a really good question. I would say he's neither A nor B. He's a none of the above. Mike Pompeo is, to me, probably the best example of the sort of the opportunistic careerist who rose far beyond where he would have risen in any other administration. There's no way, even in any other Republican administration at this point in his career, he would have become the Secretary of State. And that is a testament to, who Donald Trump surrounded himself with, the fact that he didn't have, cadres of loyalists. Pompeo is smart. He was, as Trump said over and over and over again, first in his class at West Point, went to Harvard Law School. He, behind the scenes, was absolutely, not always in agreement with Trump on certain key foreign policy matters. And in the end stage of the Trump presidency, this sort of catastrophic election and post-election period, what's so interesting about Pompeo is that he was not at all on the rigged election train. And people don't realize that because he gave this very snide press conference the week after Trump lost to Biden, in which he was asked about this, and he said something like, I'm looking forward to, the transition to a second Trump administration. And, what's interesting is that was just 2 days after, on November 9th, 2020, he, at 9 p.m., that was the first work day after Biden won the election. And Donald Trump not only did not concede the election on that day, as any other president might have, but he actually fired the Secretary of Defense, who was Mark Esper at the time, who was one of Pompeo's West Point classmates. And Pompeo, again, one of the most publicly obsequious of all of Donald Trump's cabinet officials. He was so upset about this, he called up Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, at 9 o'clock at night. He said, I must come over to your house right away at Fort McNair. The two of them sat down at Milley's kitchen table, and Mike Pompeo said, the crazies have taken over. And he was in a state of complete high alarm. He then did convene, and in fact, it was his idea to have the daily phone calls that they called the land the plane phone calls in the effort to get the country through to January 20th. Mike Pompeo, to this day, has never admitted these facts publicly. Mike Pompeo has never been challenged publicly to really discuss why it is he did not agree with Trump's claims of the rigged election. He is a classic example, in fact, of those who privately were constantly reassuring, Republican establishment types that they were, trying to hold the madness at bay, and yet, again, never ever not only spoken out publicly about it, or he's often not told the truth about his own role in many of these stories. And so I think this is the story of the modern Republican Party. Remember that, without a party that he successfully took over and radicalized the Republican Party, Donald Trump would be an irrelevant conversation to all of us. And so, to me, these characters like McConnell and Pompeo and sort of the fallacy of managing Donald Trump, it's at the heart of the story that we're trying to tell.
Well, when you quote Pompeo talking about, or even sort of snidely joking about a second Trump term, it makes me wonder, from your research, did you get any kind of insight into what would happen if he does get a second term?
Well, in some ways, I think this book is as much a prologue as it is a history. right? I mean, we wrote this book to be a history of the Trump presidency, but it doesn't seem to be over necessarily. And in fact, the publisher insisted that we put the dates on the cover. It says Trump in the White House 2017 to 2021. Now, they thought that was a way of framing the book to make clear it's a 4-year book, the first one of its kind, but now it kind of seems like a threat. Our very nice reviewer in the New York Times said, yeah, he liked the book, but he really hoped we don't write a sequel. and that's the question, right? I think a lot, this is not, it's Susan likes to say, it's a live action, situation here. It's not just history, because what he did do, we didn't do in the first term that he wanted to do is what you could expect him to do in the second term, right? He's not a policy guy by any stretch, but he learns how to manipulate the levers of power. In fact, a national security official who spent a lot of time with him in the Oval Office compared him to the Velociraptor in the original Jurassic Park movie. And you remember the scene where the kids are hiding in the kitchen. They think they may be safe because the door is slammed shut. How can the Velociraptor get in? But the Velociraptor has learned how to open the handle, and in comes the Velociraptor. This is the national security official's comparison, not ours. But the point of this is he has figured out how to make things happen. And by the second term, there will not be a John Kelly or a Jim Mattis or Rex Tillerson or any of these people, however flawed they might have been, who said, no, that's not a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't try that. No, sir, that's illegal. There's going to be a lot of the types who say, yeah, how much more can we do? So when he talked in the first term about getting out of NATO, and they try to talk him out of it, and they slow walked him, and they resisted him, there's not going to be anybody there to slow walk him and resist him in the second term. We could expect him to try to get out of NATO. He told us in the interview he would try to get troops out of South Korea unless they paid him billions of dollars that they're not currently paying. All the things he tried to do, wanted to do, talked about doing in the first term, but was unsuccessful doing, you should expect him to try that in the second term with greater success.
That's a pretty terrifying pre-Halloween thought. I know that you would like us to take some questions, so if people could line up at the mics, there's one there, that would be great. And my only cautionary note is, please make your questions a question, and not a statement, if you can. Okay, and here comes somebody.
Okay, I have a question, and it's not about anything that you were talking about. But you are members of the media, and I have a question about that. People refer to the conservative wing of the Supreme Court. It's not conservative, it's radical. So why don't the media refer to it as the radical part of the Supreme Court?
Well, look, I happen to agree with you. Actually, Peter and I are always having this discussion about, whether it's even fair to talk about, the conservatives in the Republican Party anymore, given how disruptive and radical at times the agenda is. The media are not monolithic, and, if there was one thing that I could wave my magic wand, and say is would be to get us to stop talking about the media as if it is one entity. If anything, many of the political disruptions of the last few years can be explained by the fact that the media, has fragmented into ever narrower and narrower, interest groups. So, anyways, that's my personal little wish. But thank you.
Okay, just one comment and then a question. McConnell does admit that he lost the election. Yeah. So that is something that probably kills him. Okay.
Yeah. And he gave that very powerful speech even after voting to acquit him, in which he denounced Trump in no uncertain terms.
What do you think about Trump, the man, has been so successful in galvanizing this country? What does he have? What is he touching on that nobody else has been able to do?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's still a sort of unsolved mystery to some extent. A great deal of journalistic firepower has been invested in traveling across the country to try to understand Trump voters and see what appeals to them about him. My own theory, and this book isn't really trying to get into that, we're really an inside the room kind of book, but my own theory is that, he has tapped into a broader, sense of resentment and grievance that people have. It's not about a specific policy. It's not just that he wants to have tax cuts or curb regulation. It's that he has tapped into this idea that a lot of people have, that somebody else is getting ahead on my back. And that can be racial, and that can be economic, and that can be cultural, and that could be, gender-based. That could be all kinds of things. The notion of the woke, culture wars is a direct function of Trump's appeal to people who feel like the country has somehow shafted them. And it doesn't matter that he's a billionaire from New York who has gold-plated fixtures. Somehow he is the paragon of the people. It's a phenomenon that's really quite striking. You're right about that. But I don't think it's about a specific policy set for the most part. You know, he's willing to fight. He's out there and he's shameless, and he doesn't care if he says things that are untrue, and he tells them that he's their fighter, and a lot of people believe it.
So unfortunately, she asked my question in a different way, and that is, I don't recognize our country anymore, and wondered what has changed. What has he changed? And I did read at one time he wasn't the cause; he was the symptom. But I don't think that there's much more to add. I mean, I'm scared to death of us.
Donald Trump did not create the divisions in American society, right? That's very clear. This is a longer-term phenomenon. When we were first coming of age, you know, in the 1980s, probably half of the U.S. states were genuinely competitive at some level and routinely elected a senator of one party and voted for a president of a different party. Now we're down to, you know, a single handful of senators who represent states that
one. It was just in the last election.
That's right. It went
one.
down to one in the last election. I think there were, you know,
out of like 35 or something races.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, you're talking about a geographic sorting of America, which has had dramatic consequences. Never mind when it comes to, like, say, House races, the actual gerrymandering of districts. You're actually just talking about a general separation of Americans in a way that one of the things Peter always cites that really is just mind-blowing is what percentage of Americans would be okay with their son or daughter marrying someone from the other political party. I believe in the 1960s, it was something like only 4 or 5% of Americans who disagreed with that, who would be upset about that. Guess what? Gay marriage today, interracial marriage, far more popular than marrying across party lines. This is a testament to how much our country has changed, and not necessarily always unequivocally in a good way. So, it's not clear where exactly we're headed with this, but Donald Trump has also affected the trajectory, I think, in no uncertain terms. To elect a divisive person whose political brand is division at a moment of this increasing polarization, he's taken the country arguably farther down this path in a way that it's almost now impossible to envision a kind of a status quo anti-Trump just returning. To a certain extent, Joe Biden campaigned on this notion of a kind of snapback normalcy. And, I guess I would ask everybody here tonight, we're almost 2 years in. Does it feel normal to you? No, I don't think it does. But again, that, the subject of many other thoughtful books by lots of people who have studied that particular question more than I have.
So am I confused when I think Trump is not very intelligent and he has absolutely no self-control?
Peter will take that.
Look, he's not an intellectual. Let's just put it that way, okay? He would tell you, by the way, he's super smart. And the reason he knows he's super smart, he's told us this. I was in the room with him once when he said it. He was super smart because his uncle was a professor at MIT, and that meant that he was smart too. But it's not that he has a certain animal cunning, though, right? There is a certain genius to his ability to do what we've just talked about, because how does a guy like that suddenly become the apostle of the people and beat 17 other, credible Republican candidates to win the nomination in the first place? There is something to him you have to acknowledge. But Susan's right. He is a manifestation as well as a cause of the divisions, and I think that's he is a symbol of our times because that's why we call the book The Divider. That's really at the heart of it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm looking forward to reading your book. This may be a little redundant considering the last two people, and it may be broad, but what I don't understand, again, is that you have Donald Trump who, go back to his father and is being sued for racism, for the renting apartments, and then you have him for all the things that he's done for even before he was elected president, and yet, as even though you said he lost by 7 million votes, he won. He had more votes than he did the first time.
He did.
Yeah.
And everything else that more Hispanics voted for him, more blacks voted for him than the previous time. What does that say about us?
Well, I mean, let's just say that Donald Trump is not the only one who might need some time on the couch, right? I mean, one persistent theme in Donald Trump's career and predating politics and absolutely in politics was to exploit what he knew to be and believed very deeply to be the racial divisions in our country. And he has a very crass view of race relations, just as he has a very crass view of humanity in general. And, actually, that was one of the things that I think sometimes can get lost in the overwhelming number of kind of fights and conflicts he picked, which is that Donald Trump, as a guy who's almost like studied the art of conflict, right? He is a natural born fighter. He told reporters at the beginning of his tenure that that was the secret, in fact, to his success, was to be combative. Whatever the issue was, if there weren't enemies, he would find them. But he has repeatedly seized, in particular, on racial divisions, racial conflict, anything. It was the racist conspiracy theory of Barack Obama's birth that put Donald Trump on the map as a national political figure. And I think that's why the template was never more clear than in the summer of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests began around the country. Donald Trump's instant response was to see in that, A, a source of potential political benefit to himself, and B, to fan the flames of conflict even more. And I think that's why it's almost, to me, sort of the paradigmatic Donald Trump conflict, if you will. And that's actually why we called that chapter in our book The Divider, even though the book overall is called The Divider, because I think it's at the heart of who Trump is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't read the book yet because I waited to get here, but I did look at the pictures, and one of the pictures has a caption saying, "What did Putin have on Trump?" You have any idea about that?
Well, that's a great question. And that, look, we spent a lot of time exploring that. A lot of journalists have spent a lot of time exploring that, and we don't have the definitive answer in this book. I suspect that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, they're still going to be asking that question. As Susan mentioned about Watergate, it'll be one of those, perpetual mysteries of Trump. But we have this remarkable scene in the book after this Helsinki summit where he stands next to Putin, remember, and he says he believes Putin on the election interference, not his own intelligence agencies, right? It wasn't just the reporters in the room. Susan was in Helsinki who found that to be kind of shocking. It was actually the head of his intelligence agencies who back here in Washington was watching it and just was blown away by this. Dan Coates, who was the Trump-appointed director of national intelligence, a former Republican senator, Dan Quayle's chief of staff, he watched this and he just couldn't believe it. He told his staff, he told people around him, he said that maybe, in fact, Putin really does have something on Trump. What does he have on him? And that's an extraordinary thing to think about, right? The person with access to all the most secrets of the American government, he himself thought it might be possible that the president of the United States was compromised by the Russians. And I think that really was shocking to him, and I think that tells us a lot about the sort of enduring mystery, because we don't know. Now, we asked a lot of people, and there are multiple theories. You ask people on his NSC staff, what they said was, look, he just likes strongmen, is what Susan talked about earlier. He just likes guys who seem tough, and Putin is the toughest. And he just really admires them and wants to be respected by them, and it's really more about that than it is anything specific to Putin. Others would tell you, like Michael Cohen, his former fixer and lawyer who's broken with him, it's all about money. Right? That's where they got the money when the American banks stopped giving them money. That's where they wanted to build a tower, and Trump has his dream of building a multi-million-dollar tower in Moscow. And it really is more about, marketing and money than anything else. We don't know that for a fact because we've never seen his all full finances. But that's still a very live theory out there. And Robert Mueller didn't investigate that. That was sort of ruled out as part of his investigation. He didn't look at the money. So there will be a lot of questions about that, I think, asked in years to come. But one last thing I'll say is, it's kind of one thing we discovered about the relationship. It was kind of a one-way street. Trump admired Putin, but it didn't seem to be the other way around. There's a meeting in Osaka, Japan, a G20 summit meeting, and Trump is meeting with Putin on the sidelines of this. And Trump is doing the Trump thing. He's being very braggadocio. He says, in Poland they like me so much they're going to name a fort after me, Fort Trump. And in Israel they like me so much they're going to name a settlement after me, Trump Heights. And Putin, who has Trump's number, kind of looks at him and says very drolly, maybe they just name all of Israel after you, Donald.
Thank you.
That's awesome. All right, we're close to the end here. We'll just have these last two questions, and we'll try to keep them quick if you can.
Thank you both so much for the presentation. I'm curious about what you see as the outstanding consequences for Trump, particularly as it relates to the pending legal action in New York.
Well, thank you. I mean, there's no question that Donald Trump attracts legal trouble wherever he goes, and he's lived by the lawsuit for many, many years. The interesting thing, though, and of course it's I think led to a kind of fear that accountability never finds Trump, that he has managed to sort of manipulate the legal system throughout his tenure in the White House. Right, there was this sort of fantasy by Trump's critics that there was going to be this one accountability moment and he would be dragged out, in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. Obviously didn't happen. If anything, in fact, Trump's presidency with 2 impeachments that did not yield convictions has sort of proven the impossibility of ever convicting anyone at least in this moment of extreme polarization. So arguably, actually what he successfully accomplished is to make all presidents less accountable, because in fact the constraint historically has been the fear of being impeached and removed from office, and Trump has kind of proved that that's basically impossible in this current moment. As far as the New York lawsuit by the New York Attorney General, well, I would point out to those of you who are looking for him to, face criminal sanction, this is a civil case and it's not going to happen. And certainly these are serious allegations about widespread financial impropriety at the Trump organization, which, by the way, of course, was synonymous really with Donald Trump himself. He ran this organization, micromanaged it, didn't really have a board to speak of, didn't have shareholders outside the family. It really, when the Trump organization is Donald Trump. So it's not, insignificant for the New York Attorney General to lodge such charges against it, but at the same time, it's not going to provide, I think, this, kind of single transformative moment of accountability. There are 2 much more serious criminal inquiries ongoing. There's a federal grand jury looking into January 6th and what role Trump played in that, and there is very little known. Actually, the Justice Department has really kept that close to the vest, and it's hard to say what the legal theory of the case would be to take the unprecedented step of charging a former president. It's also already been nearly 2 years, and we are within 6 weeks of a midterm election. So they are almost certainly not going to be charging him anytime before that election and before he potentially becomes a candidate for president once again. And the same thing is true on this classified document issue. Again, they would seem to have him cold on it. No one's ever been charged, former president, with something like this. And if you look at the political clock, it's hard to see, how that would actually play out. Thank you.
Thank you.
So was there one last person standing there? I can't see. Oh, okay. At the last question here.
Yes, hi, very quickly. I thought you mentioned that you said that he'd said as president not to put Rupert Murdoch on hold, and I was just curious during your interviews if he felt differently or said differently after Fox called Arizona for Biden on election night.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you couldn't quite hear the questions about Fox after Arizona call on election night. In fact, we have a really interesting scene in the book. It was so explosive in the White House when Fox did call Arizona, and they realized that therefore they were not going to basically win, and that it was Fox that was the one that was delivering the shiv in their view. They all started calling. Jared called Rupert Murdoch himself, and they called the bureau chief and so forth and so on. And at Fox, there was actually this panic in the days that followed. In fact, they literally started, the executives wouldn't let them call any other states that were going to be controversial. One of the executives said, let's just not call any state until they do the official count, which would be weeks later, by the way. And journalists were like, well, that kind of goes against the whole point of calling states. If we just wait for them to actually tell us, then it's really not much of a point. And at another point, the main news anchor, Brett Baer, actually sent out an email to the Top Gun saying that things were so bad, we're getting so much grief, I have to keep defending this on air. Let's just pull back the call, and not just take it away from Joe Biden, which would be one thing because it was kind of close. Maybe you decide it's too close to call. Let's give it to Trump, he said in this email, even though Trump was not ahead. Let's give it back to Trump is what he even said. They'd never been Trumps to begin with. So it really caused this rupture in Fox. And you're right. To this day, there's this bizarre kind of uncertain relationship between them. He goes on Hannity, as he did in the last few days, but when we talked to him, he had nothing bad things to say about Rupert Murdoch. He was complaining to us quite viscerally about Murdoch, remember? Yeah. And he feels like Fox betrayed him. And and you see Fox taking some interesting stances. Steve Doocy, the morning host, who he loved, in Jane's piece, I believe, when he ranked the Fox anchors, he gave Steve a 12 out of 10, right?
Out of 10, yeah.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And even Steve Doocy's been, calling these Republicans on the idea of trashing the FBI for searching his home. So you had this moment where I don't think the relationship between them is quite as clear as it once was.
Thank you.
I got to say thank you to both Peter and Susan. This has been a tremendous talk. And thank you for, it's a stupendous book. It's a terrific book, and for all your work, it's such a gift. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Really, really appreciate it.
very
Thank you,
much.
Brad and Lisa, and all of Politics and Prose.
I don't know why, but I have the feeling we could